What do you think the impact of AI getting access to some of these large data lakes is as it pertains to the preventive medicine field?
There was an AI created, I think it was like about 2 months ago now, that was up and running for 2 days to curate all the scientific literature, and then got taken down immediately. I'm not too worried about AI in terms of saying like, hey, I'm not going to have the ability to do a job because AI is going to cover everything, because at the end, you'll still need someone to be able to interface with another person to know and check their level of understanding and work with them. I myself have worked at creating algorithms, but there has to be someone to put the I in AI. Someone has to put the intelligence there. And the issue comes where there is a level of experience the human brings in which you can't always put down into a piece of paper or in a journal or in other aspects, in which case AI doesn't have access to. And so as AI has become more and more efficient, they'll simply help professionals or help people that are say, trying to propagate the best of what we have. It'll be an excellent tool, kind of like what the open AIs that are present now have been for the majority of the public.
How do people like us, with a drive to excel and a belief in our own agency, navigate life's complexities? How do we sift through the vast sea of knowledge to find actionable insights in areas like habits, health, wealth, and relationships? Come with me as I interview intellectuals and all-stars to refine life's ungoogleable lessons. I save you time and effort by finding the best of life's messy questions in this podcast to give you the answers. My name is Blake Bottrell, and this is the Distilled Podcast. My guest today works closely with his clients and healthcare companies to help find the truth behind longevity and health span. As a master of cell biology and bioinformatics, he can break down complex science into digestible stories, a key component of finding out where you are on your personal biological timeline. We're also going to do our best to get through the episode without letting you know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Daniel Tausan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Blake. Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So I've heard you mention that about 70% of health challenges originate in the gut. How did you arrive at that number? And can you sort of unpack for me how that should impact our decisions in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, good question. It's firing from the hip right away. 70% of the problems come from the gut. That's actually an ancient Greek, Ayurvedic, and Chinese stat. And it comes from the medicine or the way in which they approach healthcare, that if you clean the gut, about 70% of the problems go away. Now, considering today we see a large amount of metabolic and cardiovascular disease that takes pretty much the majority of all-cause mortality, about 80% of all-cause mortality is between those two groups. They're large umbrella groups. And so when you look at what's the gut doing in that, it is very much so linked with the lifestyle and the habit of eating a lot and consuming more calories than we need. And I think that's today's big challenge. So that's roughly about how I got that number. It's a bit of the ancient plus with the modern day. So it might even be higher than 70%, considering the refrigerator is quite new.
A problem of overconsumption, I don't think, would be news to anybody as it sits today. Do you have a prescriptive remedy when it comes to some of that stuff?
For the overconsumption in particular, is that the question?
Overconsumption, anything to do with gut health? I know this is not your 100% area of expertise here, but I've seen you delve through enough of the science here that I figured you would have a pretty understanding take on what we should be doing here.
Yeah, absolutely. So in regards to gut health, there really needs to be in the context specific for the individual. So the first thing you have to determine is does the person need to be eating large amounts of fiber or not? There's a very good book called The Fiber Menace, where there is an overprescription of fiber as this, end all be all, fantastic, it's not a nutrient in a sense, but necessary to your diet in order to be able to, move and defecate and keep your gut going. But there's a little bit of contrary evidence to that, where, for some individuals, more fiber is quite a problem. And so I've seen that now, quite a bit with the people I've worked with. When they've taken a lot of their fiber out, they've had an easier time with their digestion moving through. And so the key, underlying principle to remember is you want to have food that has very low transit time. That's actually the secret to, foods that are good for longevity, is that if it passes through your system fast, it's better off for you. If it's slowed down and slows down and within your gut, it gives you more time to be able to reabsorb, contents that you want to eliminate within your colon. So when it comes to individuals that are having a hard time, often it's very simple in terms of, okay, their habits are stress eating. That could be a very common problem. They could be multiple meals a day. Maybe they got really sold on the breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they're snacking between. So from sunrise to sunset, they're eating, right? And the digestive system just not set up to work that way. Maybe for the young, even in the young kids, it doesn't last indefinitely. But the slowdown of that, the enteric nervous system. So there's a complete nervous system within the gut that signals differently than any other part of the nervous system. And it will slow down. It will have issues doing the peristaltic motion. And so you can consider if someone's having a very slow amount of peristalsis, that gut squeezing motion going through the gut, but they keep eating large amounts of fiber, they're expecting to be able to push that fiber along mechanically rather than having that natural function of the intestine to move it through. So there's no simple, hey, here's the one all for each individual. Each person needs to consider what's going on within their life in order to be able to then make the right decisions for them. So, is it more fiber or less fiber? Is it less calories, more nutrient dense foods? That's been the majority of where I've stepped and intervened with. And so that's, taken away a lot of the foods in which, they're, maybe we can talk about this, but they're dead food, right? And versus food that still has a lot of nutrition in it that's alive. And today it's pretty easy to get a large amounts of calories. I think most people understand that word, even though it's quite obsolete within a scientific framework. But they can get a lot of it, but the nutrition they're lacking. And so if you're lacking nutrition, something as simple as low iodine, it'll be very hard for you to feel satiated because of how that's linked up with the hormone leptin, where you're like, hey, I'm satiated. And so all those are small little bits, and you have to work with the individual to find out what's their problem, right? And there's a mental component too, where people are hungry, but they don't need to eat. And so how do they deal with that hunger, right? And hunger comes in waves. You stave it off for about 30 minutes, and then you're fine, you're free. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question in some regard.
Absolutely. We'll get into all this stuff, and I'm excited to talk through some of these. But maybe we start with the question, how would you recommend people going about doing these N of 1 experiments on themselves? Because I think a lot of people get analysis paralysis or overwhelmed with the small minutia of things that they could improve in their life, and so they don't potentially start anywhere. What's the first step in the door of doing some of these more N of 1 experiments?
Yeah, so for maybe anyone that doesn't know, an N of 1 is referring to doing an experiment where there's just one individual or one sample that you're looking at. And you can only really do that when you take that one sample and look at it across a time span. So you're looking at the same individual, but you're changing some kind of other variable, and you keep looking at that one individual across time. And so in exercise physiology, that's quite a standard of how you go about it. You have one individual, you might track him through a race, you might put him on a bike, draw his blood as he's going through it, and you're going to have lots of data from that one individual. And in which case gives you insights in which you can't really get if you do it through, the cross-sectional, hey, I have a group, and then I compare it, because there's some very unique aspects when it comes to, and complicated aspects when it comes to biology, where we might not all have the exact same response, but it doesn't mean that it's not meaningful to the response that we're having. And so for the N of 1 idea of how you're going to go about making a science-based approach for your life is, it doesn't matter where you start. You just have to start at some point in time where you have some metric for yourself. And so let's start with the free ones. You can do any performance metric. So meaning a physical feat. You can do sprint 25 meters. What's your time for that? Okay, now you know at age 30 that you have X time for your 25 meter sprint. Okay, let's go maybe something that's not just muscular. We can go through all the aspects of muscular. You can go, a specific exercise like deadlifts, to maybe cycling, to different, even skipping, for example. So I saw a few people that choose skipping as their metric. And so in which sense now you have always been like, okay, at 30 years old, this was my baseline. At 35, 40, 55, you always have an idea of how you can compare it to yourself. And you are the best person compared to you. You're only in competition with yourself. And then now let's take it a little bit to a different sort of angle. Like, okay, what about having metrics around your cognition? So you can simply do a focus exercise, and then you can time yourself in the focus exercise, or you can do a variable changes in front of you. So you can have, for example, repeating numbers, and you see how long you can keep up with that task. That gives you some type of idea of how good your focus is, or how good your ability is to be able to maintain X amount of variables that you're testing yourself with. Let's step into something like the heart and the lungs. The easiest one to do is you need to take your resting heart rate before you've had any food, before you've done much of anything. Know what your resting heart rate is. A low resting heart rate is very good. Often very trained athletes, endurance athletes, or even the strength-based athletes, their heart rate will start coming down as their heart becomes more efficient pump. And they have complications later in life because of the way they kind of retire and go about detraining, which a lot of them don't do, and they get into complications that can result in stroke and heart attack, which is quite an unfortunate thing for athletes. But regardless, their heart rate drops, and you can see someone that isn't the best in terms of what they've done for their cardiovascular health is their heart rate is quite a bit higher. And you kind of think of it in terms of like you have so many beats in a lifetime. When you're sleeping, if it's on a low, then you're way better off, right? And obviously, you have to exclude individuals that have a low heart rate because of like a hypertension type of condition. And then you can have, for example, another metric to kind of, okay, we're doing this N of 1. And this is the one I really have to work with people to get them to understand. And usually after about 30 minutes to an hour, they see the links to it because it's just so widespread and understood. Is that your lung function is an excellent indicator of not only your immediate health, but of your long-term predictive value of where you're going to end up. Are you going to get disease at a certain age, or are you going to stave it off up until the end? And so there's tons of lung function tests you can do, again, that are 100% free. You haven't got into anything that costs any money, or you have to go see a professional. But of course, there's a limitation with all these type of metrics, and it's pretty good to have a blood value. So you can go to in Canada, you have something called molecular U. You can go get a fancy blood test. In the States, you have quite a few different ones from 10X to fitness. Is a fitness something? And it's just a blood panel that's more extensive than what you can get from a clinical approach. And the clinical ones are limited in terms of what they can tell you for your health because they're usually alarm bells when it comes to the clinical values, meaning that they're only going to be out of the range when there's a real problem. Whereas when you have some deep proteomic and metabolomic work from the blood, it gives you a lot of information from which you can act on where the person's completely fine still, giving you an idea where the organs are trending in terms of long-term health. So any place to start would be a place to start, just to have some type of information of where you're at. And you can record it for yourself within a journal. There's this idea that all geniuses journal, or is it that those that journal become geniuses? So it's helpful to have that written down for yourself and that information so that you have something to compare to, but you also have something to share when you come to someone like me. So you'd be like, hey, this is where I started off. And often people have an idea already what they want to do when they come see me. And then I interject, I give them maybe some runarounds or complications to what they've kind of set up forward. So, and this is the way I think that this is the only way healthcare is going to move forward. It's going to move forward where you're not going to wait for somebody else like you in the world to go through something in which will tell you what's right and wrong for you. Rather, you're going to have to figure it out day by day. What's best. The only person who knows what's right for you is you. I don't. I can do a lot of guessing for you and I can help you with what's in front of you, because I've studied the biochemistry and the cell biology. But at the end, only you have the feeling to be like, hey, this isn't right for me right now. There's something going on. And that's one part that's very hard to discern is that, when do you push through something? When do you taper back? Do we all feel the same thing? Clearly not. We have we'll have the same scope of emotions, but we're not all feeling the same emotions on a day-to-day basis, right? So, that's the end of one way.
So getting more into your wheelhouse then, if we're looking at taking sometimes up to 1,000 proteins, metabolites out of a more comprehensive blood analysis now, if there were, I know individual proteins or metabolites aren't necessarily the best way to go about looking at things, but if there was sort of 3 to 5 groupings that maybe have the highest ROI in fixing if they're out of line, what should we be looking for in a sort of comprehensive panel like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. That's often the question. It's like, hey, if I wanted to only look at a few, which ones are the best ones to look at? And they might change depending on who you are, at what age you are. There's, for example, alpha-2 macroglobulin is a very interesting protein. And it's in the higher end of the concentration within your blood. And it could be very useful for individuals that are pushing in, 45 plus, because it gives you different types of insights around, things that become a complication at that age. So around joints, it moves minerals around the body, but it's also consumed by, your joints in a particular way for when the proteins, it's time to degrade. So protein catabolism. And so that marker, not only is it kind of an indicator of hey, how's the liver doing? Hey, what's going on with the joints? But also it is what I would say is a exercise factor. And to me, the exercise factors are interesting because some things in your blood will change depending on your fitness status. They'll change depending on your disease status. And the disease status ones, they're useful, but often if you are not in a very great state in health, you already know that in a lot of ways. And the markers help you confirm what part to act on, right? A critical part for how we go about healthcare. But for most individuals, we're going to say you're 350, 340 days, you're okay. So, do you go get the markers that tell you for disease, or do you get markers that tell you a little bit more indicator of, hey, did I push my health to a certain level? And so in that same idea, it's not necessarily going to go get insulin IGF-1, insulin growth factor like 1. But you also have binding proteins around that. So if I can kind of cheat, instead of saying 1, you can get this family around it. And the reason why it's so useful is that those insulin-like growth factor binding proteins, they also change with age. So then you know that, hey, not only do I have a certain value in which it kind of indicates that I'm trained status, but they could kind of deceive you where just because you're fit doesn't mean you're going to age perfectly. There's other rules you have to follow. And those markers, for example, can give you an insight on age, whether you're older than your chronological age, whether your biological age showcases a state that's different from your actual age. Other ones, it would kind of go specific, but hormones are notoriously difficult to catch in big panels. You'd have to do specified, individualized tests for them. But within the big ones, these binding proteins like sex hormone binding globulin is another one that's quite easy to catch within a big panel, right? And that one's also great because it tells you if there's any issues around that's going to be very important for people, libido, but also it has to do with survival signals for the cell. So again, associated with longevity. So those are the markers that I would start looking at, is ones that give you sort of a dual or multiple insights, and at the same time be able to catch if there is any kind of real problem going towards that trajectory. And then you can really spend a lot of time going down some of the like less known but very nuanced type of like bioenergetic molecules. You can go look at the ketones. Just knowing your beta-hydroxybutyrate value is very insightful, and it gives you an idea on how fast your liver starts doing a process of ketosis. And so normally when you go get these blood tests, there's like an 8 to 12 hour fasting period. And if your beta-hydroxybutyrate value is skyrocketing through the roof, it's showcasing there's some issues with that narrow range in which the body works really hard to stay in. If it's not even up yet, you're having some issues with the liver sluggish. And that kind of tells you, okay, there's a whole, you think of it like a watch, how it has so many gears, where if, one thing is off, hey, my seconds time is off, there's more gears that are going to be associated with it. In the same way, that kind of analogy hopefully makes sense in the liver, where, hey, my ketones haven't started, but that tells you that a bunch of gears, a bunch of enzymatic pathways that are linked to it aren't functioning at a certain speed. That can give you insights. And see, let's say, I'll give you one more. I guess one that is probably, on everyone's radar would be like DHEA, which is associated with testosterone and exercise. And so there, if you're privileged enough, you can go participate in an experiment. You can get not only your resting value, but also a peak value when you're exercising, right? Very few people are going to have that. It's more people are willing to subject themselves to experimentation. And so DHEA, again, will give you an idea of a baseline and whether you need to act in terms of your nutritional status, or whether your exercises that you're doing are causing you to burn out, or whether you're right on track with them.
Is there a most stark example of an otherwise seemingly normal, healthy person that comes to you with a blood panel and you look at it and you say, these are the things, or like we're going back to talking about groupings of things that you're looking at, and you say, hey, this looks like a normal, healthy person, but these 3 things are off. This is a precursor to X. I would go get this checked out. Is there something that we should be flagging in these early stages of being early on this preventive medicine journey that we should be looking at?
Yeah, that's where it kind of comes into the power of what test did you get. And so, for example, if you go get the 10X, I think you get around 90 to 100 different markers. If you get the molecular, it's about 200 something. And they aren't the same either, right? And so they catch different things that are present in the blood. And the blood is an excellent indicator, but it's going to catch it in a way, maybe it's not the easiest to interpret, right? It'll catch, like, for example, blood clotting. And if blood clotting proteins are out of alignment, what does that mean? Is it just, the actual clotting, or is there something more that's going on there? All right. It'll look like in a lot of terms of, inflammation, and inflammation is just now this buzzword that everyone uses as a bad thing. But, keep in mind that inflammatory response is the first response to every regenerative response. And so it's key process that, is a superpower really. And because there's so many inflammatory markers, they're not all simply doing an inflammatory response, rather they're coordinating these processes that the cell needs to execute. So there has been a few I'll change the question ever so slightly, but there's been a few individuals that have come to me that they're okay. There's something's off about them. That's why they went and got this testing. But the algorithms behind the testing didn't pick up anything bad. It just said, hey, you're okay. But they have a few markers that are flagged. And so what are those few markers? Well, one, iron is high. And it's not ideal because iron, it can strip non-specifically, organic molecules. So it'll, lipids, DNA, it won't get to the DNA, but it'll just start shredding your, the membranes of your cells and proteins. And then her proteins that are supposed to be iron binding are super low. And this lady exercises CrossFit. Like she's a go-getter. She's very adamant to do it. She's been doing it now for, over a year, and she's feeling awful after the workouts, and no one's been able to tell her why. And she's tried a whole boatload of different things. And so that right away has been like, oh my goodness. Okay. What do you do? Right. There is no protocol telling you exactly, hey, this is guaranteed you have this and guaranteed this will fix it. But because there's just so much information around, each marker, you're pretty confident, like, well, your iron binding protein's low, your iron's high. And we know that the iron binding proteins that you're low in are only produced in the liver. Now, we don't have other problems with the liver that we can see from our panel, but that's not now out of the question, why isn't the liver producing this protein at an adequate level? So the recommendation is, one, go donate blood. Two, avoid high intensity exercise because you don't want to put yourself in a state where you are shifting your antioxidant system to deal with the challenge of exercise. Keep it below 80% in terms of when you're pushing, right? That should help you alleviate some of the problems. And then, go get another test after, like 6 months, see how it does, see how the donation of blood, try to support your liver as best you can. There's often a plethora of herbals and supplements that specifically target, the liver, and you got to do the guess and check method because no one like you has come around since. And so that's an instance where someone's completely fine, but there's something clearly going to go wrong very fast. While people, the other kind of very common is the bodybuilder that is pre-diabetic. There's nothing wrong with him. He's completely fine, but you can see that, the markers that would tell you about metabolic dysfunction leading to where the cell has difficulty controlling nutrients and resources, and then hormonal signaling for that is guaranteed to lead towards, diabetes eventually. Now, it might not be full-blown diabetes, by age 40 or 45, but, this is the metabolic complication. Your metabolic syndromes are going to start manifesting with different complications, and usually it's going to see some kind of allergy comes up first, or some kind of inflammatory response or reaction to things that nobody didn't. And, I've had someone that had an allergy to a sun, to the sun, not a sun, to the sun, they were allergic to. And so with the straight face, the doctor told him he needs to avoid the sun. And, he's dumbfounded at what happened to him. And so he traveled, again, he's a very active, very healthy guy, takes a lot of supplements, takes a lot of, the things in which people have to keep in mind, where this market of supplementation, like, right, 80% to 90% isn't really doing what you hope it's doing. And so, for him, it was pretty simple. We had to kind of do an elimination diet to get him back to, hey, I can go out in the sun. I'm okay. And then fix the metabolism. And then obviously he had to change and shift sort of he's not a bodybuilder either, which is the funny part. He just liked the aesthetics. So he had to readjust his goal. And it's not that he can't get there in other ways. He just has to shift some of his beliefs.
You talked about donating blood there. Is there a selfish benefit to the idea of donating blood, or an advantage to donating blood outside of the humanitarian aspect of it?
Yeah, for sure. So if someone has got hemochromatosia, if you have high iron in the blood, high ferritin, there's different markers. You donating blood is helpful to you. As to the whole humanitarian aspect of blood and blood donation, there's a need, and there's a system that uses it. Sometimes they use it well, sometimes they don't. You can just hope that the best that when you give your blood that it's being used for the individual that needs it rather than it being sold off to those certain companies, which now in ethical concerns in, financial gain, there's a lot behind that. But when the individual is going to gain health benefits from donating blood, absolutely. It's kind of win-win for everyone in that case.
What did you learn from your study on blood metabolites as it pertains to like type 2 diabetes prevention?
Yeah, type 2 diabetes, I mean, it's one of the most studied diseases. So it's extremely easy to get the science for the biomarkers when it relates to diabetes because you have an unbelievable amount of data that's surrounding diabetes and blood diabetes and you name it in terms of what people have tested. So there's a massive bias and there's a difficulty as a biologist for me to communicate sometimes information. How do I communicate a risk value? It's not that easy to interpret. You have a 40% increased risk of getting diabetes. That doesn't mean anything to the vast majority of people. It's hard to make sense even for the science side of things. And so the age has been an easier way to kind of communicate it. But for diabetes, it's also kind of this idea that it's very much so preventable, right? You can see based off the markers that are being shifted in the blood, it's markers that you have control over, right? You have control over insulin signaling. You have control over when the insulin signaling will happen within a day. You have control of how much sugar is seen by the body. You know what type of nutrients are being seen by the body. So it's very empowering and reassuring to know that there are great ways in which you can get at this, and there's lots of cheat codes you can use in order to help prevent the going towards that route, right? And so I'm for the less pharmaceutical approach and more simply understand your biology, in which you'll get more mileage out of your whole entire system if you go about it that way.
I've heard you talk a little bit about a lot of these larger biological open access databases. And one thing that's certainly on everybody's mind right now is the uptick in introduction of AI. What do you think the impact of AI getting access to some of these large data lakes is as it pertains to the preventive medicine field?
Very good question. There's actually there was an AI created, I think it was like about 2 months ago now, that was up and running for 2 days to curate all the scientific literature, and then got taken down immediately. And what I would say to that is maybe it did a really good job, and it did too good of a job, and so got taken down, or maybe just it was doing nonsense. I guess we'll never know from our end of things. I'm not too worried about AI in terms of saying like, hey, I'm not going to have the ability to do a job because AI is going to cover everything. Because at the end, you'll still need someone to be able to interface with another person to know and check their level of understanding and work with them. And, I've myself have worked at creating algorithms. So you call it like mini AIs. And I think people have a different understanding of maybe the complexity of AIs. But there has to be an I. There has to be someone to put the I in AI. Someone has to put the intelligence there. And the issue comes where there is a level of experience the human brings in which you can't always put down into a piece of paper or in a journal or in other aspects, in which case, the AI doesn't have access to. And so as AI has become, more and more efficient, they'll simply help professionals or help people that are say trying to propagate the best of what we have. It'll be an excellent tool, kind of like what the OpenAI access, the OpenAIs that are present now have been for the majority of the public. They haven't really swooped in and cleaned up people's jobs because like ChatGPT can't do math. People found that out, that it just makes basic math errors. So another AI has to come in and do the math, right? And so that means it's in a way it's about creating human brains that are present now for everyone to access. And I do think it's a great thing. Obviously, there's going to be a level of growing pains where there's going to be AIs that are going to do some damage in terms of in other aspects. Let's say it's in finance or other ways in which a credit card's locked from an individual because the AI said this guy is actually the criminal that's after, but it just seems to be a misallocation. Now the individual can't buy medication that he desperately needs for his family. That's my hope, that we don't go down towards these things as people start implementing AI without much of a, call it a second thought of how it's going to make things worse rather than better, right? It saves a little time. And I think there's enough people today where people are looking for things to do. And I think it's important for people to find that, without people, really, there's nothing interesting going on. So in order to serve and to keep keep people at the best. My hope is that we're going to start climbing up, right? I think we're somewhat at a low end of health for humanity, and I see things going for the better, so long as like we don't, doomsday doesn't approach because of AI. But that's outside of what I'm privy to in terms of information.
Is there an advantage that you could see in some of them coming in to help with the large scale data analysis side of things? Are we going to get better insights? Is there a takeaway from having them come in and be able to process large chunks of data that a human otherwise couldn't, that's going to lead to better outcomes? I know a lot of people are talking about AI as it comes to all sorts of medicine, but a lot of them are talking about it on the pharmacological side in terms of synthesizing whatever it is that comes out of additional pharmacological interventions. But is there something in your expertise that you can see on the horizon on the data analysis side for getting ahead of the curve and treating before the pharmacological is necessary?
Yeah, it will depend how quickly it comes, all on the, how'd you call it, boundaries that's been placed already now within scientific literature and the access to information. And so if you ask, ChatGPT about a particular publication, it'll say, I don't have access to the information. And so, but which is a weird thing, because at the same time, I can ask ChatGPT, for example, to give me a list of like longevity markers. So that means it's pulling it from somewhere. It has the ability to access some level of that information. And, in the last 2 years, it's drastically sped up how quickly I can get to, how'd you say it, a starting point that I can work from. Whereas I spent over 4 years going through literature to be able to pluck out over, 500 biomarkers that are related to exercise. So even from 100 years ago, looking at what was the lactic acid values that they drew, and trying to make sense for each biomarker, how that biomarker has a response. Now, if the AI has access to information, they just saved like countless hours, years for someone to be able to go and curate that information to begin with. The analysis side of things, the AI won't do anything until someone comes up with saying, like, this is the analysis that I want. Separate out, it guides it in terms of what it wants as an outcome. The issue comes extremely much in computational biology, is that you cannot treat every single variable the same. And this is where, companies have hired me, because they've got an awesome data set and they've used their analysis and they get hits, but it's not making sense to them. And that's because, they aren't able to separate statistical, like outcomes that seem great versus the biological, meaningful physiology that's actually underlying it happening. And so this is the part where you still need an individual that has, for example, the insights to be able to look at, a variable and be like, all right, well, this one is, downstream of what we're looking at, and it's going to have the highest importance or highest value. Small change in concentration here is going to have drastic effect down. Something like a cytokine or something that, it's like an inflammatory signal that could have concentration of 100-fold and not have too much meaning, because it's just calling in immune cells to the location. And because that's the case, sometimes when you do these large amounts of computational data, you need to go through each one and be like, well, I need to take this one out, take this one out, I need to transform my data. And a lot of information gets lost, actually. So a lot of cool information, cool biology also then doesn't make it to someone even like me, because it had to get transformed and filtered and whatnot. And this is where, large scale data sets have they have a massive limitation, because when there are too many outliers, they get taken out. But that's still a person. That's still someone that's functioning in such a way that's telling you, like, hey, this can exist. This does exist, and for example, cholesterol and hyperlipidemics, right? From the 70s, we've known that someone can exist with having 300% the HDL and LDL values that, someone else has, and no problems, the same prevalence of cardiovascular problems. And so this is kind of how I see, the future of it. And the more that people push towards finding pharmaceutical outcomes based off their computational data and try to incorporate, hey, let's find more drugs that are present to put in the market, the more I think they're going in a very, it's a losing direction, right? Because and I'm biased, obviously, because the people that I see, they are the ones that they don't want to be on prescription medication. They are the ones that see their mom and dads on 6 to 12 medications and they say, there's something wrong here. There's something went awry. There is a bad idea that's present. I don't want to live like this. I don't want to end up like them. And also they kind of help. They ask me to intervene to help them. And sometimes it's too late, right? There's too many drugs that are holding up the functions, in which case there's just not an easy way to be able to move them off it. And too many big lifestyle changes that need to happen in order for that person to be able to recuperate. Not impossible, but not the easiest feat by any means. And they need a doctor present with them that's geared to do that, that wants to help them do that. And that's not as often, or there's not as many doctors that can do that, to be honest. They're not trained to do that. So, is the AI going to be the end all be all in terms of finding drugs? There's going to be a very exciting time where, based off your genetics, you're going to be able to get something that may be very beneficial for you for periods of time for you to help kickstart, or let's say, mistakes you made throughout your life. But we might be decades away from that being public access, in ways in which is going to be very, call it philanthropic, where there isn't much of a gain of use of it. As I think many people are aware today that, the pharmaceutical companies, they're not to cure anything, right? They're there to get customers. I'm not the first guy to say that.
What gets you most excited about the data analysis type work that you do?
To be honest, it is, fundamentally what our reality is made of, right? I know myself to a certain extent, and the only way I can know myself more is by looking at what's happening on other people and be like, well, I'm very different. And so there's a bit of a selfishness aspect, but there's also just a genuine curiosity. What the hell's going on? Like what are we doing here? And what's possible? All right. That's been a big question of mine is what are the limits? What are the feats for human beings? And I'm constantly baffled at what people can do when anytime there is a very, how'd you say it, underdog story where someone's given a very terrible prognosis or diagnosis and they beat it, they find their own way around it. To me, that's, like almost brings, like an extra, my heart skips a beat. And so that keeps me going. The molecules that make us up, we find in almost every other creature. And they're doing a little bit different, but the same thing. Nature has a way of recycling, repeating molecules. And in so doing, you get to see through time away what's happened on our planet. So it's exciting. It's like curiosity in a way. And I'm very grateful for the people that have come to me that share their information with me, because in a way, they've shown me what's possible. They showed me that our approach to science is very dismissive. If you're just looking at these big studies, your randomized control trial. I know many people think that science is equivalent to a double-blind placebo control trial. Otherwise, it's not science, but that's far from it, right? You lose a lot of information within those kind of ventures, right? And so this is kind of another part that kind of allows me to wake up in the morning with some excitement is how good are you at actually observing the world? How good is your insight? And I never feel smart enough, to be honest, even though I've been able to snipe some really interesting scenarios that, I was correct, great, but it just feels like you're never prepared in biology. The amount the volume of information that's out there is immense. And it's, at times exhausting, and at times it's quite a relief, because there's always something to come back to, work on, learn, and, grow from.
Have you checked out any of Brian Johnson's Blueprint project that he's been working on?
Not specifically the Blueprint project. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but I know Brian Johnson wants to, live very long, and he does certain things to.
Yeah, he has this
longevity.
whole thing that he's now termed, like, he's basically just calling his experiments like the Blueprint protocol. That's his memed or like personal marketing version of explaining everything that he's doing. I was just curious for your sort of thoughts on what he's been doing and if there's been any sort of exciting revelation that's come out of any of that stuff so far.
I mean, I think he's trying to follow as best what the science shows, but has he prioritized the most important things as number one? That could be, that could be debated. At the end, time will tell. As our lifetime goes, of how far did he make it, and how good is he doing at in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Will he outlive someone from the Hunza Valley in Afghanistan, from Okinawa, Japan, from Northern Europe, that that had the centurions, from the Greeks and the Mediterraneans? Like, well, then we'll know, right? Until then, I can speak to the experiments from the animal models and from the cell culture models, and I can tell you how you can manipulate a cell to keep that cell going longer. the animal models that he's following too, that, why, for example, there's very well-known study in stem cell biology where you put two mice together, an old one and a young one, they share a blood supply, and all of a sudden the old one becomes younger. And so this is also something that's become very profitable and lucrative within, clinics, functional medicine clinics that can do this. It's called plasmapheresis. So, the individuals that can pay for a plasmapheresis, get this rejuvenating effect, right? And for example, in Canada, you can qualify for a plasmapheresis by our healthcare system if you have, for example, myasthenia gravis, and you can see the absolutely transformative effects that it has on the body, from fingernails to hair to skin to the color to the complexion. So, if someone can keep paying for that, how long will that go? How long will that push them? But this is where, when you try and do so many things, you might actually end up doing something worse for yourself that you don't know. So, to me, all the best to him. If he can make it to 100, great. But, you can't have A+ health in a C- environment. That's a guarantee. And, if you're not eating food that's alive, if you're just getting everything from pills and powders, yeah, you definitely won't make it to, the length that you'd like. And you do have to incorporate some of the secrets around oxygen and how the body and the cell uses oxygen. I think almost everything to do with longevity points in that regard in terms of the initial experiments with some of the old world knowledge. So, all the best to him. I'm excited to see what comes out as he kind of keeps sharing his, information. And does he share everything? I don't know. That's something there's always a skeptic to me where, you should be careful sharing all that information. That can be quite dangerous. If it's twisted or used in the wrong way. The best type of science is where it's instantly given out, where it has no copyright, no patent, no ability to be even refuted or, manipulated. And it's in the public sphere for others to be able to use and interpret. And so because it's not in that, sphere, then, we'll see what he puts forward.
I think we've spent a little bit of this conversation sort of dancing the line between Eastern and Western medicine. Are there certain aspects of Eastern medicine that you think we're sorely lacking in Western culture right now?
Yeah. And it's come to the Western culture in quite a large ways. I think the big picture idea is the Western medicine is very good at coming down to a molecule, this idea of something physical that's present, that's there. And then the Eastern medicine is more of this idea of what's happening across, a certain process in which they might give it a name, but they don't have the, hey, I can point to it and know exactly what it is. And so, funny enough, the Eastern medicine really is laxative and diuretics for the majority of their problems, and they work for the majority of problems. And then for the, other remainder, let's say 20 to 30%, they have some very nuanced way to be able to treat them and care for them, in which, again, they have good outcomes. The people, obviously there's going to be a quality depending on who you go to, but that's true no matter where you go. But this combination of Western and Eastern is, I think where humanity is now moving towards, where people understand that it's not enough to study a molecule. You have to understand the process that molecule's in. Once you understand the process it's in, this is the idea of bioenergetics, how things are moving through us. We're not a static. You're not physical in the sense where you're going to be here in the same state, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. There's this idea in 7 years you fully turn over. Though that's not completely accurate. It's true in some regards where you exchange your atoms. And so this whirlpool idea isn't new to Western science. Remember, the Western science mapped out how, you breathe in oxygen, it turns into, let's put you in the hot seat. When you inhale oxygen, what does it become in the body?
Water, right?
Excellent. Oh, yeah, great. And where does the carbon dioxide that you breathe out, where does that come from?
I have to assume it's a waste product of something coming out. So it's something that we've ingested, I guess, would have to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's your fat. It's
Okay.
your proteins. It's your sugars. It's you. It's your physical being is coming out as gas. So there's this almost magical process where you're taking the element of air, you're inhaling it, it's becoming water. You're taking something now that is what you'd call physical in terms of, hey, here's a piece of fat, but now it's getting converted and blown out in your exhale. And so I think there's a very deliberate labeling to the Western medicine as a certain way in order to be able to dismiss it or maybe downplay it or almost not get people to critically think of what is it put forward. So Western medicine, or call it Western science, it has done exactly that. It's taken these processes that were very, call it fluffy or airy, or like, hey, we think this is happening, and they've gone and fully shown it. They've shown what Leonardo da Vinci said. Leonardo da Vinci said that everything is connected to everything else. And so now you see like, oh, well, I very much am connected to this world around me. We exchange atoms constantly to a point where I fully renew myself within the 7-year mark, so to say. So, this Eastern and Western has been, I think a wonderful idea to be able to parse out what is it the Western is, or what is it the Eastern's bringing, what is it the Western's bringing, and have the two embodied it in different ways. And, the Eastern medicine has been embodied in lots of ways in terms of understanding when a person should be drinking water and shouldn't. And in very few scenarios, they shouldn't. So in a couple of rare instances, there's about 4 conditions that person shouldn't just be slamming water. They have to be very careful with their water intake. So again, now they have a very physical, like, hey, this thing you can't take. So they have it there. It's been present. And so, I love this bridging of the worlds that's happening. I love that our time is an opportunity for us to be able to sit and evaluate what the ancients had in their, as best we can kind of guess what they had in their understandings, and now be able to pull out the best of both worlds, right, and combine it.
I could ask this a couple of different ways, but do you have a sort of protocol for doing your best to fight against this C- environment that we're in right now? Or if someone is living a relatively healthy life and just is looking for some sort of reset to improve their life in a slightly minute way, or they just have a little bit of low energy, or they feel like some days they wake up groggy, or what that looks like, is there some sort of, panacea is not the right word here, but something that we could sort of help guide people in the right direction for how they should be looking to deal with some of the challenges that are out there right now?
That's a great question. Yeah, I would say if you think of the food pyramid, kind of has this put out at the bottom of the base of the food pyramid, it should be clean air, clean water, and that's something you don't have full control over, but because we have our own little dwellings, we have our ability to purify our water. I would say it's going to be your biggest bang for your buck. And if you live very much so in a city, you're going to be exposed to the pollutants of the city, right? The monoxides, the chlorine everything that's kind of there, right? Just quote unquote pollution. Obviously, if you live outside where there's a lot of forest or countryside, you're better off. So it's easier to get that clean air. So if you are stuck in an apartment, you can do your best to get like an air purifier, but just as much as you can, not necessarily get an air purifier, control the fact that your environment isn't, for example, full of mold. And there's oftentimes a very sad state when you see the way someone's living. They'll have like wet, damp towels. They'll be thrown all over the place. That attracts, growth, microbial growth. Microbial life loves water. And, for example, the way they keep their food in their kitchens. So there's a way in which you can control clean air, clean water. And that would be the biggest investment in returns for you to clean up your environment. And obviously then that kind of goes more to societal question of, how more can we together, clean that and keep a, clean environment. And there's a, obvious, we're not going to be able to do that within a very fast amount of time within cities, right? Cities are kind of notorious for that. But think of that almost like a microcosm too, where if there is a certain industry next to you, are they outputting things, in a creek or within parks nearby? You need to avoid that area, right? Like you petitioning it, that'd be great. That might be a start, but that's, decades long transformation that needs to occur.
I've heard you mention the idea, and this comes back to something that we were talking about earlier as far as some of the lung capacity stuff as being a good predictor next to blood panels. And the idea being that achieving a high VO2 max, or like a high 1 rep max for, say, going back to these achievable metrics that we were looking at earlier, can have sort of a lasting effect, even if not maintained. Can you talk a little bit to that and what the mechanism is there for sustained maintenance over time, or improved health span, even if the feat is just achieved once?
Excellent. That's absolutely fantastic. So I'll unpack that a few things. One, in terms of VO2 max as a measure, what does lung function really tell you, and this idea of adaptation and how long that really lasts for. And so because VO2 max is looking at how much oxygen you can take up, all right, maximal oxygen uptake as you go through exercise, it's looking at multiple physiological systems, right? It's looking at one, your cardiovascular system, the lungs, the heart. It's looking at the actual flow that's going into the ventilatory capacity of the lungs, then the flow that's going to the muscles, and how the muscles are extracting it. So because it's going across so many organ systems, if it's in a good spot, it's kind of telling you that those systems are also in a good spot. Your nervous system must be decent enough to have the neural drive to push that much. Your ventilatory capacity must be good enough for that gas exchange. Your blood system must be good enough in order to be able to bring that blood where it needs to. And your muscular system must be good enough in order to be able to maintain such a output. And so it is the best marker for whether you will die from anything, right? Lightning, car accident, disease, you name it, right? If you have a high VO2 max, you have more likely chance to survive everything. But that said, you can still have a high VO2 max and get a heart attack. It's not out of the question, right? And so that's why it's nice to have more measures than just VO2 max. There's also the size of your lungs versus how size of the engine versus how efficient the engine is. There's other aspects in which VO2 max can't really completely parse out. And so it is a phenomenal standard, and it really kind of showcases to the importance of the lungs. And I have a little bit of a bias based off the people I've worked with that the lung function tests are almost some of the best tests to predict a person's health, because I have like a 93-year-old that has Alzheimer's and a blood panel that looks like he should have been dead a decade ago. But he's still alive, he's still kicking, and he has good days, he's got bad days. But his lung function's phenomenal. He's got issues with blood pressure, his heart rate has some issues. But when you ask him to do different lung tests, okay, slow your breathing down, okay, blow out, it's great. And so coupled with that's an extreme example, but these other examples that I have in terms of people's lung function linked with other markers that I have for their health, it seems that lung function is an excellent indicator of the rest of how the system's doing. And so maybe in the VO2 max, even though you get so much information in terms of, hey, I'm inferring that the muscular system's strong, lung tests almost like it's okay if the muscular system isn't great, because in some of these people, their muscular system isn't super built up, yet they're living well into the 90s, if not into 100. And so I think there's something very important in that regard of how the body is bringing in oxygen and its efficiency in that regard. And then if you put in some effort, especially young age, this is why for kids, they should be, exercising as a priority for them to go do stuff, is that you build your body. And when we look at longevity, if you look at any kind of even disease, but let's just talk about longevity, there's first, how long will the cell survive? That's the first thing we have to at least get over. So if the cell can't make it past 70 years, doesn't matter about anything else. That's sort of the bottom line. Now, if the cell is doing great and it's going to be able to survive for, let's say, up to 100, now the question is, can the cells work together in unison for that physiological function, for the lungs, for the liver, for the heart? For when they all work together, does that process go without any interruption? And it seems that if you mess this up, it really doesn't matter how much your cell can go, like you're done for. And so this is where the training, where if you put effort in at some point in time, you're going to want to impact the way the cell looks in terms of how the quality of DNA, how well you are protecting it, your antioxidant system, the signaling, the metabolic signaling that's telling the cell what it needs to do. It'll help keep it in a great state. But now you've built up a physiological system in which it functions in a very effective manner. The nervous system is connected well to the muscles. The hormonal signaling works well. Everything is there, in which case there's no clear problem. And so anytime someone puts some effort into exercise, they'll get some benefit. If they put in a lot of effort in a particular part in their life, let's say they spend 6 months in their 35 to develop a high VO2 max, depends on the type of training they did, but you will adapt your system now and you'll be pretty good for 3 to 4 to 5 years, depending on, how well you maintain it. In which case, you've done this little benefit for the cell and your physiology is adapted, in which now you can coast. And so it all depends on, again, what you did, who you are, what age you did it at. And then you can always get information on it live. Your heart rate, again, that's why it's such a good marker of, your longevity. Hey, you put 6 months in, but your resting heart rate is still the same. Like you didn't push, you didn't do a smart enough training regime. You might have wasted a lot of your time, right? If the goal was to make advances into your call it physical performance. And there's thresholds that need to be surpassed in order for biology to have an adaptation. So, and this is where there's this very key thing where, there's just so much science already out there. It's great to have someone to help you, right? So when you want to push through, it's like, hey, how do I spend 6 months? People are busy. People have lots of things going on in their life, or even 3 months. How do I make it the most effective 3 months? I got lots of time. This is going to be a lull for my business. What's my best method? And for that, I give, obviously you need to do some type of resistance training and then some cardiovascular training, right? You got to pick your cardiovascular training. You want to row, you want to swim, you want to cycle, you want to run, or you got to do something quite elaborate, but you got to be good at it, like skipping or something else. And, when you do that, then that's going to help build out the cardiovascular system. The resistance training, you can waste your time in there or you can be very effective. There's very simple 3 principles. You're either training volume, resistance, or speed. If you have a little, program in there, you can do 45 minutes twice a week and you'll see that you'll continue to improve across 3 months if you follow those principles. So the training adaptation to me is also very fascinating because I love to exercise, but I'm also very lazy, right? Like I don't want to do it every day where I'm just going to push myself. And I've done it. I've done a lot of it and I've done a lot of it wrong where I've hurt myself. I've hurt my, my joints, I've burnt out. And then I got some help, right? And then I got, for example, twice a week where I'd go really heavy, high intensity. And I saw improvements that I didn't see for years, or I was pushing myself, like twice a day sometimes. So that's where it comes into, one, you need to listen to yourself. There's might be an idea, hey, this is good for you, but if you got to know how to be able to, pick up the signals that your body's telling you. And, you need to have some type of, I think, guidance or at least research beforehand before you just jump into it.
It's great. I love it. It's a fantastic prescription. I have one final question that I like to ask all of my guests, and that's what's the last opinion or belief that you changed your mind about?
I actively don't hold many beliefs. I try and stay as much as I can to knowledge, right? My beliefs are at a minimum. The one that has probably the most difficulty I've had in my life is I have a hero complex. I think I can save, and fix all the problems, right? And for some people, that's great. Hey, I help them. But I had a belief, and this is, I guess, probably the one that was the most of a roadblock for me, where if I have a solution, you have the problem. There you go. Here's the solution. Done. And it has been a mind opening that if the person is not ready for the solution, it doesn't matter. I can't force it in. There's nothing I can get mad at them. I can try and, pretend like I can berate them, or I can try and uplift them, encourage them, any kind of approach. I'll do anything as a coach to get, the positive outcome, but it's their journey. Like it's their learning. It's when they're ready to accept something. And so knowing something intellectually is one thing. Knowing how to live it or incorporating it with your life is very different. And so this is why I'm okay throwing out secrets out into the world, because knowing intellectually is just one thing, right? People forget it. It's still something I have to check, with my life today, because, I want to help people. I want people to be in their best skin. And I've come to terms with recognizing that like people like some vices. They're not going to do everything that's good for them. And so where do we meet in middle ground? And now it's easy to be able to just stay out in the open and kind of move forward in regards to what they want. And which also then makes them easier in terms of like, okay, this guy's not going to try and put too many things that I'm not ready for on my plate. So there you go. I think maybe that one suffice.
Daniel, I love it. I think the work that you're doing is super cool. If we want to send people to check out all your stuff, where should we send them?
They can find me on my website, Timeline Sciences. Very simple idea. We have one timeline we're all part of, and science helps describe the timeline we're on. So Timeline Sciences plural. You can find me on Twitter. I am a heavy duty scientist, and I've just started the social media stuff. So I'm just getting my legs going on there. But if you message me directly on X, I will get back to you. If you message me on Instagram, Timeline Sciences, I probably message you. It might take me a week or something. I'm not ready for that platform as of yet. But you can find me on my website very easily and explore the website in terms of seeing if I can help you.
Perfect. Thanks for joining me this afternoon, sir.
Thank you, Blake.